Recording.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, and take it away, Lara.
Thanks so much, Gabby. Thank you to the CAP organization, and hello, everybody. Very nice to meet you virtually. I'm just going to quickly share my screen here, and we'll get started. Hoping everybody is able to see. Perfect.
All good. Perfect.
Righty, so I'm just going to minimize this. And great. So yeah, as I've mentioned, thank you very much, Gabby, for the opportunity to speak with you all. It's really a great joy for me to be able to share with you all the really super important information that we've gleaned over the past year. Actually, it's been a year in the making. And really the conversations that we've had with all sector representatives, not just public sector, but with private sector, with industry manufacturing sectors, on how their work in the world of decarbonization is going. Is it progressing? What are the successes that we can scale up? What are the challenges that we need to be able to fundamentally address? And I think really the ultimate goal in the conference that Gabby was alluding to a little bit earlier was really to be able to accumulate all that information, to be able to knowledge share that amongst each representative from all those respective sectors, which was really kind of key to the discussion, and really finding ways in which we can all connect in a more collaborative, communicative, and holistic way, ways in which we can actually address decarbonization through a holistic lens. And I'll kind of touch on that in a little bit. So a brief sort of breakdown of what the webinar presentation is going to be comprised of. I'm going to be walking you through a little bit about what Carbon Coalition actually is, and certainly a little bit of information pertaining to the actual conference itself. Who was there? What were the sort of breakdowns and goals and objectives of that particular day? I am going to be walking you through a little bit on the terms. A lot of us kind of already know this information, so I might be preaching to the choir a bit here, but I think it's important maybe for those who might not be as familiar with the terminology that I'm going to be discussing, to kind of outline that in a bit more information with a bit more detail. Certainly the different types and processes for making EPDs, that was really quite a critical piece. And then I'm going to walk you through the actual findings. What were those sector-specific challenges? What were those sector-specific opportunities? Again, for all industry, private and public sector representatives. And then, of course, I've sort of framed and concluded the discussion with some key takeaways that would be for the audience that we have today. And I think after that, we'll open up to questions and comments. So a little bit about the Carbon Coalition. Really, KIRKOR Architects and Planners founded the Carbon Coalition as a subsidiary company in 2024, just last year, really in an effort to connect industry experts to develop holistic strategies, which is what I was mentioning a little bit earlier, in reducing embodied carbon in the built environment. So this is through education and advocacy. And I say holistic because it's really important to be able to understand the definition of what holistic actually is. It is the belief that the parts of something are interconnected and can be explained only in reference to the whole. So if we apply this concept of holistic strategy, holistic thinking, which involves all the sectors involved, industry, manufacturers, public and private, you'll hear me say this often. The strategies for decarbonization are comprehensive, they are consolidated, and they are effective. So this was really quite a key piece to why we actually founded the Carbon Coalition. And our mission was really defined by 3 points that you see on the screen there. The first is really having to do with bridging the information gaps. There is a need for carbon data through environmental product declarations, which I'm going to be speaking about a little later in the presentation. And really the intent of this is to be able to understand what our overall carbon footprint is within the very buildings that we design, at least for us as architects, but at least for as well for yourselves as it relates to the approval and the planning of it. And there's a big rush to us to be able to actually get the EPDs in, to get the data in. A lot of the municipalities that KIRKOR Architects work with our developer clients, there's a lot of municipalities that have green development standards or green building standards implemented that dictate timelines, carbon caps, carbon reporting. Those are really quite important to be able to address. So the first point is to be able to bridge those information gaps. The second is really having to do with understanding what the challenges are. So in order for us to be able to understand that in a little bit more detail, we need to understand what the challenges are specifically. Let's articulate them. Let's dissect them. Let's reverse engineer them. Let's overlap them. Let's see what we end up finding. This is really quite a key piece to why we actually wanted to be able to found the organization of Carbon Coalition. And you'll see in a moment how that actually tied directly into the conference itself in November last year. Finally, it's really having to do with aligning our efforts and being able to address the impacts in a more comprehensive way. I said this at the conference last year, which is that industry change is not possible with industry. We really need to be able to incorporate and involve and engage with industry manufacturers to ensure not only the actual targets that are being set by policy and legislation are being implemented, but that they're being communicated. And I'll mention one of the sort of a teaser, I'd say, in advance of the forthcoming slides, that a lot of our industry manufacturer peers did not necessarily know that there were green development standards dictating carbon reporting, carbon caps, and or timelines associated to it. So one piece is to be able to communicate that with them, but also to ensure that the efforts within decarbonization, not just through policy and legislation, are actually being implemented from corporate objectives as well. A lot of our clients, we'll talk about in a minute, are really finding that they want to be able to meet the ESG requirements with and the sort of sustainability goals that they've outlined to their stakeholders. They want to be able to incorporate those corporate objectives for decarbonization across their portfolio. That, in conjunction with policy and legislation, both need to be communicated amongst one another, but also to our industry manufacturer peers. So that's really what our mission was about. But what was the conference exactly about? So as you can see, we have 5 main objectives, the 3 of which I've already mentioned, which is where our mission came into play. And the final 2 were the actual points that I wanted to be able to specifically outline during the conference, which is really focusing in on 2 points, specifically from translating the concept of decarbonization as an idea into actual practice. This was critical. Finding that translation of theory to practice actually illustrated its series of challenges in and of itself. Those challenges were highlighted during the conference. Those challenges were actually highlighted within the report, and for which has been published for all to see and to be able to ideally work together to address. And then finally, our main sort of concluding note here is really, at the end of the day, solutions are always welcome, but I think the real point of this discussion is to understand what the questions are. There's a lot of questions that many representatives from all of those respective sectors have that they don't necessarily have the answers for. And if we're able to actually bring everybody together, each sector will be able to answer each other's sector's questions. And that way, you will actually be able to have a more comprehensive discussion. But the first point is, let's get all the questions out on the table. Let's answer them as comprehensively as we can. And really, if we're able to find solutions thereafter, that's ideal. So who was in attendance at this particular conference? We actually had a really interesting group, a really well-rounded group of individuals, from architects to builders to owners, engineers, levels of government. We had federal and municipal levels of governments. We had environmental organizations, third-party organizations. We even had levels of industry, as you can see, the noted in green there. I wanted to be able to highlight them specifically in green because you'll see that there's actually a scale of industry that's happening here. It's not just the actual individual product manufacturer, but we actually had representatives who are product distributors, meaning that they actually distribute and resell a number of different products that they have. In addition to this, we've also got industry associations and industry councils. So we're not necessarily only addressing the scale of operation from a single company, but we're also looking at it to the scale of operation and needs of a consortium of manufacturers and companies. That will allow us to be able to understand what those needs are from a sort of fine-grained detail of the individual company to the full gamut of the full group of consortium of manufacturers. And I also wanted to be able to identify that the representatives from the industry manufacturers that were present were really also well-rounded as it relates to the scope and typology of products that they were specializing in. So from roofing to concrete and steel to waterproofing to sealants and envelope to actual materials with regards to glazing and interiors like finishes and gypsum and plumbing. We really had a full range of products available as it relates to representation that are really being used to build a building from inside out, top to bottom. That was really quite a key piece to the discussion and really one of the important aspects to the conference. We really wanted to make this as well-rounded as possible. Okay, so prior to findings, I think it's important to be able to lay out some of the key terms that I'm going to be frequently using throughout the discussion, throughout the webinar today. Again, some of these you probably know quite well. I'm just going to quickly run through them just to sort of bring everybody up to speed. So there's sort of four components that we have here, as you can see outlined on the screen. We have our embodied carbon, we have our life cycle assessments, also known as LCA as an abbreviation. We have our global warming potential, or GWP. We also have our EPDs, as I mentioned earlier, which are our environmental product declarations. So embodied carbon basically refers to the greenhouse gas emissions of the manufacturing, the transportation, the installation, the maintenance, and of course, the disposal of what those construction materials are that's being used in buildings. So long story short, it's essentially your carbon emissions associated to the materials and construction processes of your project. This is really just the sort of bare bones version of it. Life cycle assessments are basically essentially means in which you can actually track what the actual materials and energy and environmental impacts are for those products within the life cycle of a product, within its full life cycle, meaning its beginning of life to its end of life. The second important, or the third rather, I should say, important point here is having to do with our global warming potential. A really short and easy way of referring to this is that it's very simply your embodied carbon value. So if you want to know how much embodied carbon there is in a project or in a particular product, you need to be able to understand what the GWP is. That's the actual value that's associated to quantifying your embodied carbon. And finally, we have our environmental product declarations, or your EPDs for short. This is very simply, it's kind of like a report card, essentially, that basically shows what the environmental impacts are of that product. It includes a number of different environmental impacts, but the one that is most interesting to us, at least in the context of this particular webinar, is the GWP. And as I've mentioned moments ago, GWP is essentially the carbon value, your embodied carbon value. So really, ultimately, in order for us to be able to quantify our embodied carbon, we kind of need the document that shows how much carbon is in the product, and that is your EPDs. So it's important to know that part of the discussion that we had at the conference was not just to highlight to manufacturers as well as to all other respective sectors the need for EPDs, but one of the key questions that we received in our engagement and outreach with manufacturers were, well, who's asking for EPDs? Why are they asking for it? What's the need for it? I can create an EPD. In fact, some manufacturers have EPDs, but they still had these questions of the who, why, what, and when. So one of the things we wanted to be able to do as part of the beginning portion of the conference is just to be able to simply answer those questions. Who's asking for it? Why are they asking for it? When are they asking for it? And what are the benefits beyond the actual market demand, which I'll walk you through in a minute, so that we can actually convey and impress upon the manufacturers that the need for EPDs is great, but also the benefits for creating EPDs is beneficial for you as a business case, as a manufacturer. So just touching on the increasing market demand, as Gabby mentioned earlier, I'm an architect myself. We work with a number of developer clients, and we've seen as part of I'd say over the past couple of years, really, a really great increase in the demand for quantifying the embodied carbon emissions within the projects that we're working on. This is actually a really great trajectory, a really great discussion that we're having with a lot of our sophisticated clients that have those reporting requirements for embodied carbon, that have sustainability objectives. And they're really wanting to be able to make an assessment of the sort of carbon values, not just of that particular project, but across their entire portfolio of projects. So really making us a very robust series of goals and within quick timelines too. So a lot of the projects that we've worked on from an architectural standpoint, really started looking into decarbonization strategies and goals as early as 2023, in some cases in 2022, really in and around our sort of pandemic that we went through. And of course, we have levels of government, yourselves as representatives. I've talked about green development standards or green building standards, really being able to sort of outline the sustainability goals and climate action goals that each municipality or township has. And really that legislation or policy is coming down the pipe. We have a lot of manufacturers who are not necessarily aware of what those goals are, number one. They're also not necessarily aware of what the requirements are, that they are in fact sort of specific carbon goals, specific caps and reporting and timelines associated to it. The second is that there's market evolution. This is really quite an important piece. We need to be able to understand that certifications and designations for certain projects like LEED, among many other things, CAGBC, ZCB, well building standards, living building challenge, etc. These all need to require and have that information at hand to be able to understand what the EPDs are, what the carbon values are for you to actually get the certifications. Similarly, it's important to note that sustainability strategies is not necessarily stuck within the realm of policy and legislation at a municipal level, and also at an actual federal level, but that this is actually starting to be translated into building code. This is really important because we need to be able to understand and communicate this to not only our manufacturers, but in some cases to our peers in levels of government to say that there is a movement towards reducing embodied carbon through legislation, but specifically through building code. In particular, the National Building Code is looking to be able to illustrate this as an actual sort of line item segment within the National Building Code by 2030. So this is real, it's happening, it's coming down to pipe, and it's going to be standard across the board for building codes and building standards. So some important notes as it relates to benefits beyond the market demand, like what is the business case for manufacturers to be able to develop EPDs? It's really important to be able to do that because they need to know what's in it for them. And I think there's a huge list of opportunities for manufacturers when they do post their EPDs. And certainly this was something that was communicated to the group to say that product transparency is a huge bonus. Manufacturers have an opportunity to be able to share through transparency, through communication with their respective prospective clients to say that, you know what, whether for good or for worse, this is the carbon value of our product. Clients respect that. Clients appreciate that. So much so that a lot of times we're finding a lot of our developers are actually specifically requiring and requesting products that have EPDs. They don't necessarily care about the carbon value at this time. They just want to know what products have EPDs. This is being translated into our specifications, as I've noted in there. This is really quite key, and this is one of the driving forces for why we are actually required to be able to ask of our manufacturers as architects that, do you have an EPD? Our clients are looking for EPDs. I will say that there's also a component here with regards to marketing and promotion. This is a great opportunity to advertise the good work that you've been doing as a manufacturer with regards to ensuring that your processes, your sustainability strategies, and or the fact that you're simply creating an EPD is a huge bonus. Advertise that, market for that, promote it, and really understanding what those hotspots are, understanding how there's opportunities for greater optimization as it relates to the actual processing and manufacturing of your product. Those are all big benefits. So I think it's also important to be able to identify that there are different scales of sort of taxonomies, if you will, of different types of EPDs. I've just highlighted the top two here that I think are probably most relevant to us as it relates to this particular discussion. And really, they're sort of identified in the specific EPD and then the industry-wide EPD. Product-specific EPDs are important because it's actually generally speaking, publicly available first and foremost. Industry-wide is publicly available as well. But the benefits of a product-specific EPD is that it's coming from a single manufacturer for a singular product, meaning that the information pertaining within the actual EPD pertaining to your global warming potential or your carbon value is that much more accurate. It is not averaged out. versus an industry-wide EPD, which still has accurate information. It's not to say that it's inaccurate. It still has accurate information, but you can kind of see that it's coming from a number of different manufacturers who are producing similar products. Those products and their information and data are then averaged out amongst one another, and that creates an EPD that is industry-wide, meaning it's sort of industry average. It's also sector-wide. It's another way of calling it. So many developers and even in some cases public sector representatives are encouraging the use of product-specific EPDs. This is also something that we as architects are communicating to our manufacturers that we work with all the time. But certainly there's a lot of opportunities with both. There's merit in utilizing industry-wide EPDs as a sort of a baseline just to get things started, because at least the costs of creating an EPD are shared amongst your peers, amongst your associated manufacturer peers. So they each have their sort of pros and cons, and I'm actually going to talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. Okay, so this is actually quite a significant illustration and slide. And I really want to be able to dive into this in great detail, because it's really critical to be able to illustrate how an actual EPD is created. Many people do not know about this. We actually had to engage with third-party verifiers to be able to articulate what the processes are. And this was really important, not just for myself as an architect, because I find this information interesting, but also as it relates to educating myself and yourselves so that we can actually communicate this comprehensively back to industry manufacturers so that we can actually articulate and answer the questions that they have as it relates to making an EPD. If we don't have those answers, the likelihood of them actually generating an EPD is going to be much lower. We have to be able to educate ourselves to answer those questions with great detail. And if we don't know them, at least provide them with the resources that they need to be able to educate themselves. I think this is really quite important. So let's get into each of these specific steps. You'll see there's 7 steps there, and I've kind of illustrated in a sort of pathway there. You'll see this pathway sort of in the next subsequent slides, and I'll break it down for you. So the first and foremost is having to do with your program operator. Your program operator is essentially your company or your trade association that's essentially organizing and managing the development as well as the publication of your product category rules, which I'll get into in a minute, as well as your EPDs. So they are basically acting as a central authority, ensuring that the EPDs are credible, that they're transparent, that they're compliant with the rules that have been set out in governing the creation of the EPD. So they're kind of like the principal of the school, so to speak. Product category rules, very simply put, they are really essentially the rules for developing an EPD. That's all that it is. It's specifically rules for developing and conducting the life cycle assessment. And that in turns help develop the actual EPD for one or more of those product categories, as I've mentioned there. Really, essentially, it's the rule book. They're creating the rule book of how the LCA is created. And really, this is an important point, and I'm actually going to read it straight off my notes here. The intent of the PCR is to ensure that similar products can be assessed, and this is very important, or reviewed in the same way, making it an apples-to-apples comparison, making them actually comparable, because the rules that different products have amongst one another needs to be compared at an equal level. And so that's why your PCR is very, very important. There's also data collection for your LCA. I'm going to touch on this in the subsequent slides a bit. But long story short, it's essentially exactly as it's described. We're collecting the information to be able to inform the LCA or your life cycle assessment. And then once the LCA is created, which is your product LCA, you'll have your essentially your background report, which is basically just a sort of exhaustive version of your life cycle assessment. It then gets third-party verified, which is critical. That ensures that the EPD is in fact independently verified. It ensures accuracy, reliability, among many other important points here. And then once everything has been verified, documented, and assessed and reported, it then goes back to the program operator for review and then subsequent publication. So with those 7 steps, your EPD is in fact developed, published, and utilized. So remember this 7-step piece here, because in the subsequent slide, And I know it's a little bit small here, but no worries. I'm going to walk you through each of these points. This is basically became the foundation for what we call the Embodied Carbon Living Map, or the EC Living Map. It's essentially a map that we generated and created not only to capture all the comments that we received in our year-long outreach, research, surveys, feedbacks, phone calls, meetings, discussions among all the industry sector manufacturers, associations, but also with private sector representatives and public sector representatives. You'll notice that you'll see that the bones, and I'm going to try and get the laser point here. There we go. You'll see that the bones of the map are the same steps for creating an EPD, from the program operator to the data collection, to the third-party verification, to the EPD publication. This is at the heart of the map. After this, you'll see we'll start to get into actually the procurement processes, the project LCA, I should say, and then of course, policy and legislation. These are basically called our topics. There's 10 topics. We have sections, which are these colored nodes here, 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 and here. Those are basically drawn from our workshop discussions. We have subsections, which are here and here and here and here. Those are, again, specific themes drawn from our discussions through the workshop amongst the many other conversations that we've had. And then you'll see that there's all these little dots here. These are basically called nodes. Nodes are essentially the comments and feedback that we've received. The size of the node dictates the number of volume of information that we received from all parties. The larger the node, the more comments that we receive. The smaller the load, meaning not many people mentioned it. It's sort of an in passing discussion. And they're color coded to be able to fit within the actual categories that you'll see there. So let me see if I can actually get back to the rest of the slides. Okay, perfect. So let's start to break down what each of these comments were, what each of these discussions were, whether drawn from our outreach and or from the conference itself and or from the actual workshop. So the first and foremost sort of discussion that we heard that was really quite fascinating, if anything, was about the EPD process itself. We had a lot of conversations with our industry manufacturers that they themselves actually recognize that EPDs are an important piece. EPDs are critical as a tool for decarbonization. This is very important. I don't want to make a generalization because there were some manufacturers that didn't agree with this, but for the most part, for the majority, I would say, there was an agreement that EPDs were a tool for decarbonization, which is a very encouraging sign. And they also were able to recognize that the EPDs would help them meet their own goals for decarbonization, meaning they might have their own sustainability goals in mind that the EPDs will help them actually achieve. And they also fundamentally agreed and believed that through the actual opportunities for EPDs, they could actually become leaders within their own respective field. This was quite an important piece, quite an important discussion, and something that I believe is very encouraging to be able to see amongst our manufacturers. Now, what were the actual challenges that were involved? We saw specifically a couple of challenges. There was challenges with regards to how do you actually start in the actual EPD process? Where do you begin? How do you actually get help in creating the EPDs? The other items that we saw, that there was a bit of a discussion on the need to have versus the like to have. So some manufacturers felt that since this is not necessarily a requirement by code, which we kind of sort of already discussed earlier in the slide deck to say that it is becoming code, that they shouldn't bother spending the time and or money to actually create an EPD. A lot of the information that we found also is that there was discussion on there being no change. No change being that there was a sort of a belief in the leadership within the manufacturing facilities and or teams that some of those manufacturings that are not making an EPD, that there's no reduction in the number of projects that they're receiving. So regardless of whether or not they have an EPD, they are still getting projects. So they said, well, what's the point? There's also the discussion with regards to the timelines, the sheer volume of time it takes to actually collect the data for developing your LCA, which in turn informs your EPD. Not many people were aware, but it actually takes in and around a year to be able to collect all your data for your life cycle assessment. So if there was a request from, say, a developer or an architect or whomever to say, we need your EPD in a couple months' time, it's not as simple as that. It's important to be able to understand that there's timelines associated for meeting each of these specific goals. And certainly there was also discussions as it relates to the actual verification. There's no real means of verifying what those materials are going in and out of the manufacturing plant, which I thought was actually quite an interesting concept. So some may actually even adjust the quantities to ensure that they're getting lower embodied carbon values. That's not to say people are actually doing that, but the fact that there's no means of verification might offer that opportunity, although it's something that is very much discouraged. Of course, there's other items, as I've noted there. I won't get into them too much because there's a fair amount of slides to run through. But there's also just creating general agreement across the sort of group of manufacturers on what the actual PCR is. So what is that product category rule or that rule book for actually creating your EPD? Then, of course, there's the discussions on the PCR expiry, the EPD expiry. They do become invalid over 5 years. And then, of course, there's the discussion of EPD optics. They're worried that the EPD might make their product look bad. So I just want to flip to the next slide because there's a part 2 to the EPD process. There were sort of top 6 challenges that manufacturers had as it relates to specific questions pertaining to the EPD process. These were questions that we've actually had our third-party verifiers have sort of an EPD roundtable with myself to kind of respond to directly. So people were worried about the EPD costs and time, as I've noted previously. There's a lot of unknowns as it relates to funding. There's funding out there, but what is it? Are you eligible? How can you apply? Those were all a lot of unknowns. And then you'll see the subsequent 4 points there that we've specifically answered with as it relates to PCR applicability. They were worried that the actual application or the type of PCRs that are available are not necessarily aligned with the product type that they have. So one of the things that our third-party verifiers noted is that it's important to be able to work with your program operator. As you remember, they are the organization that help govern what the PCRs are, what the EPDs are, and making sure that they're meeting the requirements. So working with them is very important, but also ensuring that they'll be able to help you in creating a PCR and or that's applicable to your product and or the sort of discussion points as it relates to creating a new PCR that would be respective to your particular product. There was also a lot of questions actually that we received from manufacturers as it relates to switching of suppliers. As you all know, we're in a little bit of a bind economically in the market right now as it relates to the trade war. Some of the suppliers that they worked with, these manufacturers, may not be the suppliers that they can work with today, just given the tariff situation. So how do we ensure that the EPD that I created that was using certain materials from certain suppliers, if I switch them out, does that mean I need to make a new EPD all over again? Because as we've discussed, it takes a very long time to do so. One of the key things that the third-party verifiers noted is that you actually don't need to create a new EPD if it's not a major change. If it is a major change with regards to your material and energy, then you do need to redo your EPD. But if not, then you don't need to make a new EPD, which was a huge bonus for a number of manufacturers. The other piece that I consistently heard from a lot of the manufacturers that we engage with is that there was a real concern that their secret sauce was going to be shared. That the EPD is going to be illustrating all the different materials specifically that makes their product that much more special in comparison to their competitors. It was very important for us to be able to answer that, and our third-party verifiers made it explicitly clear that that sensitive data, that sensitive information is not shown in the EPD. Rather, it is outlined in the life cycle assessment report, for which they are actually not publicly disclosed, number one. But number two, as a third-party verifier, they actually are required to sign a sort of privacy agreement or disclosure form that ensures that that document does not get published or no beans have been spilled, so to speak. So it's very important to be able to identify that. And I wanted to be able to highlight that not only in the report, but in the conference, but also in this particular webinar. So everybody's aware that no secret sauce is being shared. EPD limitations and comparability was another important item, as you may recall in the few slides back. I was talking about the importance of the PCR and how that is actually creating the rule book for what the actual functional unit is, what the actual information that's being laid out so that it is actually, in fact, comparable with different materials. A lot of the manufacturers we've spoken to and engaged with were saying that there's an unfair advantage. People are looking at the GWP and they're using those particular products with a low GWP without really fundamentally understanding that the comparison between materials needs to be done to ensure that the PCR is aligned. If you have a product with one set of rules and another product with another set of rules, you need to be able to acknowledge as, say, a landowner or an architect that wants to choose a particular product for the project, keeping in mind the embodied carbon sort of objectives and caps, that we need to be able to ensure that the PCRs are the same so that there is, in fact, an apples to apples comparison. This is very, very critical. There was also a lot of discussions as it relates to the supply chain. Supplier education was really quite an important piece. A lot of the manufacturers mentioned that the suppliers are not necessarily understanding what EPDs are. So part of the roles that they then have to be able to implement their own EPDs is then to educate the supplier. That's a whole set of time and logistics to be able to understand and communicate that to your suppliers, who then need to generate their own EPDs. And this sort of leads me to the next point. Many suppliers do not have EPDs for their products. So suppliers either pull an industry average EPD, or they actually, the manufacturers, I mean, pull an industry manufacturer EPD on behalf of the supplier for the products and materials they're using within their own EPD. So it's an average upon an average upon an average. You can kind of see the scale of operations and how that actually sort of dilutes the information a bit more. There's also discussions on supply chain costs, labor costs, production costs, etc. It's important to be able to identify the location of materials and products. As we all know, not every grid is a clean grid. We need to be able to understand that and how that actually sort of adjusts the actual carbon value of those particular materials and products. There was also discussion amongst the manufacturers saying that a lot of the concern that they have is how do we quantify the embodied carbon pertaining to raw materials? That was another sort of scope of discussion there. Of course, tariffs was an important point. It was a hypothetical at the time in November 2024 during the conference, but certainly in our engagement with the manufacturers post-conference and especially January onwards, we really reached out to a number of different manufacturers to be able to better understand how the tariffs are actually affecting them. And generally speaking, for a lot of the specific industries pertaining to curtain wall, window wall, and or steel, steel and aluminum, as you can see, window wall utilizes a lot of aluminum. Tariffs are detrimental. In other cases, I actually had brought up with a number of them the notion of retooling. Is this something even possible? Is it relevant? They actually came back to say in some cases it is possible to retool, but in order to be able to get the scale of operations out as it relates to scaling up the actual implementation of the retooling, but also scaling up the production of materials and products is going to take a lot of time and a lot of sort of equity to be able to roll that out. Interprovincial trade barriers, we kind of already have heard this a number of times in the news. This is really quite an important piece and something we also communicated to the manufacturers to get their input. Generally speaking, removing the trade barriers are beneficial in some cases as it relates to packaging, but the main sort of focus that we heard from manufacturers is not so much as it relates to removing the trade barriers, but rather as it relates to increasing the actual knowledge base of our labor and increasing the labor to be able to help roll this out in a lot quicker, in a quicker sequence. So the other piece, as you can see, we're starting to get into the latter half of that diagram of the embodied carbon living map, where we're really starting to get into not necessarily the industry manufacturer items, but really more so pertaining to private sector representation and concerns, as well as now soon to be public sector representation and concerns. There's still a lot of tiebacks and overlaps with manufacturers, as you'll see, but I'll sort of walk you through each of those items. So again, as it relates to agreement and consensus, it was quite clear that both industry and private sector representatives agreed that specifications, which is sort of our own sort of manual that we use to be able to actually build buildings at the end of the day, are critical to decarbonization. They sort of dictate and outline the execution of the requirements that need to be implemented on site in working with our contractors and working with the client and working with ourselves as it relates to the architects. What are the roles? What are the typologies of specifications that are out there? And how do we actually get that information on site? So there was an agreement as a whole that industry and private sector representatives recognize specifications are key and critical to this pathway of decarbonization. This was a huge piece. And a lot of the challenges that we found were pertaining to the actual wording of our Division 1. I won't sort of get into this in too much detail, but basically this is again pertaining to the wording of the execution of how you actually implement the contract work on site. And how do you actually integrate EPDs as an inclusion or a line item within your specifications? This was very important. But a lot of the important things that we found were pertaining to the actual life cycle stages. The manufacturers were actually concerned that the whole building life cycle assessment, or the WBLCA, was not necessarily taken into account as it relates to the actual procurement process. So again, being able to understand what the PCRs are as it relates to what life cycle stages are being included in your EPD. Am I only looking at the upfront carbon? Am I looking at the full spectrum of the carbon assessment from stages A through C? I'm sure many of you already know this. I won't get into too much, but in order for you to be able to understand and compare the products, a lot of the manufacturers were concerned that we're only looking at the GWP value. We're not understanding the rules that were implemented to ensure that that GWP is comparable with their own product, not just as it relates to the life cycle assessment stage, but also as it relates to what the actual functional units are, etc. Current and accurate data information is important. They were also talking about standardization of the templates for your specifications. This was another discussion. Continuing on procurement here, because I think it's important to be able to highlight, is a lot of the manufacturers and private sector representatives, again, agreed that early engagement between both parties is critical to ensure that those sustainability goals set out at the beginning of a project are in fact implemented at the end of the day with regards to its actual occupancy and built form. This was really quite important, and there was consensus that education for trades and contractors it was a huge and is a huge opportunity, because at the end of the day, we can set out the goals till we're blue in the face, but if it's not actually being implemented on site through your specifications, through your contract documents, but also as it relates to educating the individuals involved in building the building, the actual logistics of getting it done become more complicated, and or if not, the actual objectives that have been set out on the sort of planning and design side of the project for decarbonization, the likelihood of it actually being implemented on site is slim to none. So we need to be able to engage with the team early through design assist, bringing on the manufacturers early to be able to work with the prospective clients, and in some cases without the guarantee of attainment, but at least with the conversation being had, there's an opportunity to be able to share from the manufacturer to the client group that the type of work that they're doing, what the benefits are of their product, how it is a low carbon product, or at the minimum that it has the EPD and the required documentation that they're setting out for. Certainly as it relates to integrated project delivery, or IPD, we hear this often. This is quite critical to be able to engage with our contractors, consultants, engineers, everybody involved from the beginning of the project to the end of the project, to set the guardrails early. What are the sustainability goals for the project as communicated by the client, so that we as a full team are able to actually implement those goals at each of the subsequent phases of project, from schematic design, design development, construction documentation, contract administration. This is very important, and if we're not able to communicate those goals early, again, the likelihood of it being implemented is going to be slim to none. Trade engagement, as I mentioned, is critical too. So what about project lifecycle assessments? So we talked about product LCA. Product LCA is the document, as I mentioned earlier in the slides, that inform your EPDs. But what about project LCAs? Project LCAs are those lifecycle assessment reports where we actually document how much embodied carbon is in the project as a whole, like the building itself. So again, there's a real agreement and consensus that there needs to be project LCAs, not just as it relates to verification. And this is sort of where public sector can come in too. How do we actually ensure that the policy and legislation and or carbon caps that have been set at time of site plan approval for this LCA report going in is in fact implemented? Right now, it's a bit of a loophole. But also as it relates to project LCAs for the actual developers to ensure that what they have set out and guided the team at time of design and or concept is in fact actually implemented on site. This is through real-time life cycle assessments or real-time LCA. And as I mentioned here, I sort of highlight each of those stages, right? The sort of design, the working drawings, which is basically your CD phase, your tender and bidding or procurement and negotiation, and then of course your actual CA, which is your construction occupancy. The working drawings is an important piece here because we need to ensure that the actual materiality that has been solidified at that time through the actual attainment of the different products, the actual outline and illustration within our specifications, the massing has been resolved by that time. So it's in our interest to be able to ensure that we create a life cycle assessment at time, at least permit, to be able to ensure that, in fact, what were the changes from our design through site plan approval to permit or construction documents, but also to ensure that are we actually in the same playing field or the same targets that we had set out at the beginning? Is it actually being implemented with these products? So again, tender and procurement, as I mentioned, we need to be able to engage with the team early. But again, how do we actually ensure that the materials and products and the GWP or the carbon value that was set out at the beginning of the project is implemented on site? That's how you can actually create a real-time LCA at time of occupancy. Many, many, many participants, shockingly, from actually the developer teams, were saying that we need to be able to ensure that what we've actually set out is implemented. And sustainability consultants, along with them, agreed that that's something that we need to be able to do. Policy and legislation. Now we're starting to get into public sector findings. Again, there was an agreement among all sectors, and this is actually important, including government representation, including city staff, agreed that there needs to be more communication, more education, not just for all those involved in the process, whether that's the manufacturer or the private sector or the public sector, but within the actual processes themselves. So for example, city staff, for example, trades, and then also for those who are not necessarily involved in the process. So again, your general public, what do they know about it? How do we educate it? One of the private sector representatives at the actual conference said it very eloquently. Sustainability is the best kept secret in the world. We need to be able to communicate this. And one of the best ways to be able to do that is to engage with each tier of sort of groups, whether that's the general public, whether that's within our own teams through integrated project delivery, whether that's within amongst the city departments that we have. And of course, there was also reference to provincial participation. This is a bit of a touchy subject these days, but their participation is critical. They need to recognize that they have a huge role to play as in creating a united front, not just federal and municipal, but they are the missing middle, so to speak. If they are involved and integrated, we can have a united front as it relates to climate action. So some synergies that were discussed, again, amongst all sectors, which was really very important, is that there was an agreement, and specifically among manufacturers, which is, again, generally majority of manufacturers, I would say, were in agreement that policy and legislation were key to decarbonization. This is super encouraging. We are on the right track. Let's keep going. Let's develop it in a way that is holistic. Let's develop it in a way with engagement with the teams and especially with industry. This was very, very encouraging to see. But a lot of the participants did highlight that there is some issues with regards to alignment, with regards to the actual balance and feasibility of these targets. And it was really important to ensure that there was actual accurate and viable execution. So I'm going to talk about this a bit with regards to the actual challenges. So as we know, some policies are not necessarily mandatory. Some of them are actually voluntary, depending on a tier system and or sustainability metrics, depending on your municipality. There's also different timelines for legislation, some of which has actually been rolled out recently, this past March. Others are things that are going to be rolled out in the coming years. Being able to communicate this is something specifically manufacturers and private sector representatives wanted to be able to identify. What were those timelines? How do we get that information out? And if there are changes to the timelines or targets, in advance of the timeline, let's get that information out for everybody to see as a public announcement. The targets were also an important piece here. So many commented on the importance of balancing carbon with health and with well-being. This was an important piece there, but also as it relates to understanding the balance between operational and embodied carbon. So we actually had a segment for the private sector representatives, public sector representatives, and industry manufacturers. When the panel for the private sector representatives came on board, they were talking about the importance, from one of our sustainability consultants, we're talking about the importance of balancing that operational with the embodied. In some cases, they actually do conflict with each other, but if done in a certain way and then done in a way in which targets for both are actually allowing for that threshold to be balanced between the two, it is in fact possible to achieve. And there's a lot of different strategies for meeting both. They talked about geothermal among many other things, but the key piece is to be able to understand what that threshold is, where if we compromise, if we actually, rather, I should say, meet the targets of the requirements for operational, it could come at the cost of embodied. Or if we meet the targets applicable for embodied carbon, it could come at the cost of embodied carbon, of operational carbon, rather. So ensuring that the targets that are set for both are allowing for that threshold to occur, in a sense that it's a balanced approach. Finally, this is the last slide. I know we've walked through a number of items here. This is the last slide pertaining to the actual embodied carbon living map. Again, you'll be able to read this in the actual report, for which Gabby and the CAP Association will be able to distribute later in the actual presentation. But you'll see that there is also this component of creativity, which I think was kind of interesting. There's this notion of risk and resiliency. How do you actually balance the two? And a good majority of the participants agreed that, again, addressing housing and affordability was a really key piece, and it shouldn't come at the cost. It should not come at the cost of sustainability. There is this belief and this momentum and this consensus, which is very encouraging to see amongst all, that we do need to be able to promote and continue and implement the actual sustainability strategies that we all are in some way, shape, or form working on. But how do we do it in a way that is not going to compromise on the housing and affordability? So it's important to be able to note some of the challenges that were brought up through our workshop component, and again, in our year-long outreach with all sector representatives. So one of the key pieces that they talked about was really having to do with innovation and creativity. So this is kind of the balance between prescriptive versus performance-based strategies. So prescriptive meaning no matter what, this is the targets for these specific material types, for these specific carbon caps. But if it's a performance-based sort of strategy towards meeting those targets, it allows you to be able to get to a certain volume of embodied carbon, regardless of the typology of material, regardless of the strategies to get there. So you have a little bit more freedom as an applicant or as a developer or as an architect to be able to get to a certain carbon target. But maybe it's not necessarily structure, maybe it's not necessarily envelope, and maybe it's not specifically those two things at that particular carbon value, let's say. There's other main ways in which we can go about it. So that was one of the key topics that they were talking about as it relates to innovation and creativity, and specifically as it relates to the carbon reduction methodology. So performance-based, not so much prescriptive. So the building design and typology was also important because a lot of the components that we sort of discussed in the workshop was really talking about ownership. So rental buildings have a different requirements than condominiums. Rental is really probably going to be better off with your operations, your operational carbon, than your condominium would be. That's because the ownership typology requires and affects different carbon outputs. So as a long-term ownership strategy, you're going to be more focused in on making sure that the equipment that's being utilized to service your building is going to be long lasting, energy efficient, etc. But understanding that that typology would render different results, different carbon values. So the sort of baseline standard of meeting a certain cap or a certain requirement might not necessarily work for the different ownership typologies. The other important, interesting point was pertaining to the actual adaptive reuse and recycling roadblocks. So there's a lot of, unfortunately, the system is sort of disincentivizes, I should say, recycling, just given the actual costs. But there's a huge opportunity for manufacturers to be able to utilize recycled materials from things like recycling industries. They come with a bit of a caveat as well, just as it relates to where these materials have come from. But it's an opportunity nonetheless that should be explored. And certainly as it relates to the materials that are available, the buildings that are available that are just sitting there unused, we should be able to reutilize them and implement the actual sort of housing strategies with the existing building stock that we have. A lot of actual municipalities across this country are doing that. And we should probably learn from them and implement it within our own respective townships and or municipalities as well. I won't get into the amenity uses and lifestyle changes, but there were concerns as it relates to redundancies and typologies of amenity, just given the location of your building in the context of an amenity-rich neighborhood, and also concern that there might be worries that these carbon targets might actually affect your lifestyle. Again, I won't touch into that too much, but you can read more about it in the report. There was also concern as it relates to materiality scope. As I mentioned, just sort of few points earlier as it relates to innovation and creativity, we should be able to look at different materials beyond structure and envelope. There's nothing wrong with structure and envelope and ensuring that we assess them. We should. They are very high carbon sort of elements to a building, but there's also other means and or materials to be able to assess. And if there's ways in which that sort of performance-based pathway, as I mentioned earlier, that would actually support looking at other materials and being sure that we can still get to those carbon targets, not necessarily in that prescriptive way. Bio-based materials, I'll just quickly touch on this. There was concern about the utilization of this. Actually, in some of the research that we had done at KIRKOR, we found that majority of the bio-based materials are applicable by code, but they're not necessarily utilizable at scale. So they're particular for Part 9 buildings, which are not necessarily as high rise typology as a Part 3 building would be. So we need to be able to ensure that these bio-based materials are being understood from a policy and legislation standpoint, that if this application of bio-based materials is being utilized, that it should be utilized according to code and what is being available as it relates to its co-compliance. There's also concerns as it relates to its co-compliance as it relates to its firing, its fire rating, its actual structural integrity, as it relates to its potential for decomposition and so forth. There was a lot of comments pertaining to that. Many of these bio-based materials, I will say, meet all these requirements, but I think the key piece here is just ensuring that it's co-compliant and applicable for different building typologies. So Part 3 versus your Part 9.
Lara, just on that bio-based materials,
Sure.
just on that, is that related to the insulation and natural products being used for insulation? Or
That's
okay, so it
exactly
is kind of speaking to the building envelope still in terms of it's not necessarily like fixtures within the building per se. Okay,
That's
gotcha.
exactly right. That's
Okay,
exactly right. Yes.
thank you.
Thank you, Gabby, for asking that question. It's important to clarify that. And ladies and gentlemen, we're near the end of our presentation. I'm just going to walk you through a few important key takeaways that we actually summarized and highlighted in the report. The first being, again, as I mentioned, the performance versus prescriptive pathways. There's a lot of different ways to get to those targets. Let's loosen it up a little bit so that we can actually get to there, and actually allow for there to be a little bit more innovation and creativity to be able to meet those targets. We'd be surprised in the different strategies that we can actually get to the same place through different means. There's also discussion during and throughout the conference really about the flexibility and the resiliency in target setting. So ensuring that ensuring that the targets actually work with the times and or the market and or the particular situation that we're in. For example, we were in a pandemic not too long ago. We're in a bit of a trade war now. So how do we ensure that the project applications meet the intention of the guideline and or target? If there's ways in which we can actually ensure, specifically at least for guidelines, that if the projects meet the intention of the guideline, that's worth it, that's actually sufficient. Again, it's project specific. Again, it's Green Development Standard specific. Again, it's guideline specific and location specific. So this is all sort of, take this with a bit of a grain of salt, and that it should be thought of as an overall overarching sort of discussion here. And that way, at least, it ensures that the decarbonization goals that frankly majority, regardless of what sector you're in, is actually in alignment, that those decarbonization goals, whether you're a manufacturer, private sector, public sector representative, is actually being implemented in a far more feasible way. I think this is really quite important. The other important piece that we have heard consistently from manufacturers is that they want to be engaged more with the public sector, especially as it relates to target setting for particular requirements, as it relates to particular products and or materials. So they need to be involved because they will be able to articulate back to the public sector representatives what is actually the industry standards, what are the actual products that are available, what are the actual carbon values for these particular materials. I think that's really important because that engagement is going to ensure that the targets being set by policy and legislation is in fact realistic and feasible. So they want to be able to be engaged with you. Feel free to reach out to them. They want to hear from you. And also, I think it's important to be able to engage with industry manufacturers because, again, in a lot of our manufacturer outreach, in our surveys and conversations, they actually don't know. They don't know what the actual green development standards are, the green building standards are. They don't know what your requirements are and the timelines associated to it. Is it to a particular material? Is it structure or envelope or otherwise? They have no idea. So for them to be able to learn more about it from the public sector representatives is a bonus, not just for yourselves as it relates to communication, but also as it relates to the education of our manufacturers. We need to be able to be working together and to ensure that our manufacturer peers are in the know consistently. I will also add in here a few more points, if I may. Just quick note on verification. We sort of talked about this a little bit earlier in the slide deck. Let's consider closing those loopholes as it relates to those real-time life cycle assessments. Let's see what that means. Let's actually quantify the data that we're trying to retrieve, not just as it relates to the design stage, but what is the actual result? We could actually specify a project that's net zero or near zero at design, but is it in fact actually becoming that at the end of the day when we build it? Let's see, let's actually quantify it, at least from a reporting perspective, not actually as it relates to any other means, but just to be able to report it. And of course, there's 3 layers of communication, ensuring that all city department staffs are in alignment. And actually, you'd be surprised, we have heard from city staff at the conference talking about how city departments are not talking to each other. This is not my words. This is from city staff telling me this from the actual workshop, the feedback. And this is really important. And I think, honestly, it's something that's already happening. We've engaged with a number of public sector representatives. They have made it very clear that they are actually engaging with all other departments in some way, shape, or form. If anything, it's more of a continue the good work, continue the communication, continue the discussion, continue the education and amongst all the different department staffs. And if that means that it's simply an educational session or an ideation sort of charrette in the form of like a visioning session, that might be a tool that you can use to be able to help ensure that those departments are really in alignment with not only the sustainability goals, but that it concurrently meets their own respective department objectives. And again, this was a consistent comment that we received as well. People want to be able to see the results of the green development standards or the green building standards. Communicating that, whatever it is, the successes or the challenges, not just amongst municipalities, which again, I'm hearing from public sector representatives is in fact taking place. And again, with the good work Gabby and CAP is doing, that is taking place. But certainly as it relates to communicating it out to the general public, which leads me to my next point, what are the matrices and or data and or statistics that are being associated to the implementation of these decarb goals? If there's a way in which we can actually say, we have accomplished such and such as a result of these green development standards, or if not a green development standard, at least a sort of policy or legislation pertaining to decarbonization or sustainability as a whole, it doesn't even have to be embodied carbon respective. At least that way, there's an understanding that we have in fact done something comprehensive, that it is actually rendering real results. A lot of municipalities are actually again doing this. It's really again more of an encouragement to keep up the good work and to continue to do that. So we started off with the presentation talking about how we're looking at holistic strategies, meaning ensuring that we're not just looking at the specifics of particular items, but looking at how those specifics actually create and inform the full picture. And that's really where this embodied carbon living map came into play. And certainly as it relates to accumulating and articulating and implementing and illustrating all those respective comments from every single representative from all those respective sectors, it's very, very important to be able to highlight. So I want to thank you all for sticking around for this presentation and learning a little bit about the good work that we've been doing. We hope to be able to continue the conversation. I've outlined here some information, not just on our websites, but also as it relates to contact information. If you have a question, I'd be happy to be able to answer it. And I want to thank Gabby again for the opportunity to present and share the findings from the report. You'll be able to read it at our website. So thank you so very much. And yep, we're ready to go.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lara. Really appreciate you walking us through the map, the road, like the different stakeholder roadmaps. That's really, really helpful because I think that's always one of the things we struggle with. I think we focus in on what between our specific stakeholder and what our role is, but we don't necessarily kind of have a good sense of what we're doing and how that impacts other stakeholders' roadmaps as well.
Exactly.
So I'm going to open it up for questions that you may have. I know that's a lot of information, but here's an opportunity to have Lara kind of provide you some insights on some questions that may have been going through your head in terms of where are your opportunities to advance the embodied carbon conversation. And I know municipalities have been bringing, as they've been updating their green development standards, have been bringing in embodied carbon into that consideration. And in particular, many municipalities are bringing that into their own retrofit and net zero kind of considerations as well, trying to understand what role they can and what decisions they can make to reduce the embodied carbon calculations associated with their progress on net zero. So just I'll leave it open for folks if they have some questions for Lara. And then while you're waiting for those questions, I may as well advance the polls that I have. Where's my polls?
As I mentioned, it's okay if you don't have questions now. Perhaps something might jog your memory and you might
Yeah.
be able to ask a bit later and or that's totally fine too. You can certainly email me otherwise.
Okay, perfect. One of the things I did want to highlight, we are recording this video. I will be sending you out Lara's presentation. I've already thrown in the link for the report itself, but I, of course, will throw that into the proceedings. One of the things that's also a goal of these webinars is also to engage. Like we know that you guys who are joining this webinar are probably the leaders on trying to advance the embodied carbon conversations within your municipalities. But one of the key things we're trying to also advance is like, okay, how do we advance the need to consider embodied carbon across different municipal departments? So
Mhm.
if you do think that there's other folks in your municipality, you will be able to share the proceedings from this webinar with them. There's also opportunities for kind of having those conversations in terms of the report as well, in terms of what's available to the municipality. I know that number of municipalities are also struggling with trying to understand what Bill 17 means to municipal green standards. And I know that it's not a lot of clarity right now in terms of it. We do think that the province is planning on undermining the ability of municipalities to mandate their metrics, particular like the the operational carbon associated with the building's operations.
Mhm.
The Ontario Building Code doesn't address embodied carbon at all.
Mhm.
And as such, there is no conflict or anything like that, even though many municipalities will also say like there's continued reference to Bill 17 being a construction standard, and no municipality that I know ever considers their green development standard a construction standard. There
Mhm.
is always performance standards that are attached to it, but not anything that's like thou shall do it this way, and that conflicts with the Ontario Building Code. So there's a
Mhm.
lot of, I know that there's a lot of confusion right now in terms of what Bill 17 means in terms of green standards, but we will be there's a lot of still conversations taking place with the municipalities, and in particular those municipalities that already have green standards in play
Mhm.
and brought into their official plan and don't have to go back to the province and the minister for approvals for anything as well.
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
did want to kind of give a little bit of a kind of an update in terms of what does Bill 17 mean for this? We're not exactly sure yet, but we also know that we have to start addressing both operational and embodied carbon, both for new developments as well as for existing buildings and in retrofits as well. So we got to figure out ways to kind of
Mhm.
help build the capabilities across the different market players.
Yep, 100%. Very, very important, very relevant to the discussion. Absolutely.
All right, so then I don't think we have any questions. Thank you so much for all of you for your patience and going through the different roadmaps. And I know that it clarified a lot up for me. It was a little, at the beginning, it's still confusing to kind of go
Mhm.
through. So this is like the different pieces of the map. Thank you for
Yes.
helping us navigate that kind of mapping of actions and stakeholders. Really appreciate it. And thank you as well to everybody for joining this. We'll send out the proceedings. If I don't get it out to you tomorrow, it will get out to you before the end of this week.
Perfect. Thank you,
Thanks so much,
Gabby.
Lara. Really appreciate you sharing all of the insights from the
My
conference in
pleasure.
such a kind of package and nicely packaged way.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks,
Thank you again,
everyone.
Gabby. Take care, guys.
Have a good one.
Bye bye.
Bye.